All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Diana Schulach. I am the program manager at Family Focus Resource Center. I am at the Cal State University Northridge office. We have 3 other offices in the lobbies of the North LA County Regional Center, which are in Chatsworth, Santa Clarita, and Antelope Valley. We welcome you to stop by anytime or call us with any questions. We will be putting all our information in the chat shortly. And I hope you've all registered for our newsletter, and that's hopefully how you found out about today's workshop. Today we are joined by Disability Rights California, who's going to be presenting on IHSS Basics. This is a 3-part series for the next 3 Mondays, and all the Spanish workshops for these same topics will be on Fridays, all at 10 a.m. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lonnie, who will give you some information on disability rights. Thank you. Thanks, Lonnie.
Thank you, Diana, and welcome everyone. We appreciate you spending your morning with us. I know how difficult it is from the weekend, but thank you very much. So for those who don't know us, we were formerly known as Protection and Advocacy. We are a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1978. We are federally mandated to provide legal services for people with disabilities. Some of the issues we work on can be anything from special education, public benefits, regional center services, housing, employment, and many others. We have offices in Sacramento, Los Angeles, Bay Area, and San Diego, and then our smaller office is in Fresno, Ontario, and Modesto. So today your presenter will be Daniel Hernandez, our staff attorney. We'll talk about IHSS Basics. Thank you, everyone. Oh, one last thing. Please put your questions on the chat. We'll get to them at the end of the training. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Like Lonnie mentioned, my colleague, my name is Daniel Hernandez. I use he, him pronouns. And today's topic will be in-home supportive services. If we can go to the next slide, please, Lonnie. Great. And just before we begin, we do want to provide a short disclaimer that the following presentation is meant for education only and doesn't constitute legal advice nor counsel. And that's because everyone's situation may be unique and require careful attention. Also, we want the audience to keep in mind that the information in these slides could become out of date in the future, and that's because the laws and local practices relating to these matters are constantly developing. So there's a possibility that if you refer to this presentation a year or 2 years from now, things may have changed at that point, and the information would not reflect the correct information. Okay, go to the next slide. Now, let's provide an overview of what we'll be discussing today in regards to the in-home supportive services program, or the IHSS program. We'll provide a brief description of what IHSS is. We'll explain who may be eligible for this program or service. We'll also discuss what kinds of services IHSS can provide individuals who are eligible. We'll also explain a little bit about the process of applying for IHSS, and then subsequently appealing if somebody disagrees with a decision made by a county in regards to their IHSS services. Okay, next slide. So the very important and basic question, right? What is in-home supportive services? Also known as IHSS by its acronym. So IHSS is a Medi-Cal program for people, including children, with disabilities to remain safely in their own homes. It also includes individuals who are 65 years of age or older. So IHSS is an alternative to out-of-home placement. Think of facilities or settings like nursing homes or assisted living facilities. So IHSS is an alternative to out-of-home placement in those settings. So IHSS provides basic services to people who cannot safely perform tasks themselves or need prompting. And by prompting, we mean, for example, reminders or physical cues to do certain tasks. And then we'll explain what these tasks are in a few. So IHSS is administered by each county under the direction of the California Department of Social Services, or CDSS. So the state delegates a lot of the management and operations of this program to the counties, to each individual county within the state, which is why the main point of contact will be a county staff member or representative and county social workers for IHSS. Okay, go to the next slide. So that's a brief description of what the IHSS program is. Now let's talk about who may be eligible for IHSS or these services. So any California resident may be eligible for IHSS if they can meet the following criteria. So one, the person must be either blind, disabled, which includes children with disabilities, or be 65 years of age or older. That's one requisite. The next requisite is that the individual be Medi-Cal eligible or receive SSI. Just to expand on this a little bit. So when an individual receives SSI, they also automatically receive Medi-Cal. So the main requirement here is that the person be Medi-Cal eligible. And what I'll also say about this is that there has to be a Medi-Cal eligibility determination, meaning that if you have not yet, you have to apply for Medi-Cal and be provided some sort or some form of verification that you are eligible for Medi-Cal in order to proceed with the IHSS process or receipt of services or hours. So that's the second requirement. The third requirement is that the individual is living in a home or apartment, not including a hospital, a nursing home, an assisted living facility, or a licensed care facility. And as we'll explain in the next slide, home can be, in some situations, be broadly construed. And we'll discuss that more later in the next slide, because the concept of home or own home under the IHSS program is different as other programs. So that's the third requirement. The fourth requirement is that the individual cannot live safely at home without assistance from another person. So four requirements. A person has to be either blind, disabled, or 65 years of age or older. Second requirement is that the person has to be Medi-Cal eligible. The third requirement is that the person has to be living in a quote unquote home or apartment. And lastly, the person cannot live safely at home without assistance. Okay, can go to the next slide. So quote home, unquote, what does that mean? So under California law, and the specific laws of Welfare and Institutions Code, which is where a lot of these laws concerning public benefit and social services programs are located. So home under the Welfare and Institutions Code is defined as an abode of your own choosing. This doesn't mean that only single-family homes or apartments are considered. Alternate living situations are allowed. And here we have examples of a few. For example, RVs, trailers or mobile homes, shelters for unhoused individuals or homeless shelters. Also, emergency extraordinary circumstances are allowed. And an example of this could be, let's say you are an individual who was evicted from a home and you begin staying with family members temporarily until you can find replacement housing. Although, right, in our usual interpretation of what a home is, the person may not have a home at that in that situation, but this emergency extraordinary circumstance is allowed. And so a person under this situation could be eligible for IHSS. And so here at the very bottom of the slide or the screen, you see an all-county letter, a link to an all-county letter. And all-county letters, we sometimes refer to them as ACLs by their acronyms. So an ACL is a letter that's published by CDSS, or the California Department of Social Services, that contains guidance to counties when the counties administer certain programs, such as IHSS. So this particular ACL, the link that you see here, clarifies information about the IHSS own home policy and provides more examples of alternative living situations. So you can definitely look at that and see the various situations that would be considered and allowed in order to meet this living in your own home or apartment requirement. Okay. So throughout the presentation, we're going to have questions, right? And then as I'm going to read the question and then I'll read the answer choices. And then please, if you're comfortable, write in the chat what you think the correct answer is, or make a mental note of what the correct answer is. And then in the next slide, we'll tell you what the correct answer is and then provide an explanation as to why. So let me read the hypothetical here and then the question. So question 1, Martha is 32 years of age. Martha is disabled, which makes it difficult for Martha to safely perform tasks at home by herself. She used to live in an apartment located in Long Beach, but she recently moved because she cannot afford rent with the SSI benefits that she receives each month. She now temporarily resides in a friend's home in Downey. Is Martha likely eligible for IHSS? So 2 options here, right? Yes or no. Those are your 2 options. So if you feel comfortable, please put the answer that you think is correct in the chat. We'll give everybody a few moments before we go to the next slide to go over the correct answer. And as a reminder, right, there's requirements to be eligible for IHSS. 1, you have to be either blind, disabled, including children, and or 65 years of age or older. A person has to be Medi-Cal eligible. 3rd, a person has to be living in their own home or apartment. And lastly, the person must not be able to perform tasks by themselves safely without the help from another person. Okay, so give it a few more moments. Okay, I'm looking at the chat and everybody's batting 100, 1,000 for 1,000. Everybody's getting it correct. So yes, we can go to the next slide. The correct answer is yes. Martha is likely eligible for IHSS. So let's go over the requirements again. Is Martha, another requirement I did not previously discuss was, is Martha a resident of California? Here we can assume yes, right? Next, is Martha blind, disabled, or 65 years of age or older? Yes, here the facts tell us that Martha's disabled. Next, is Martha eligible for Medi-Cal or SSI? And remember, when you receive SSI, you also automatically receive Medi-Cal. So yes, here Martha receives SSI, so she's automatically receiving Medi-Cal. So she's eligible. Now, is Martha living in what's considered a home under the IHSS program? Yes, because she's in an alternative living situation. She's no longer living in her previous home because it was too expensive. So she's now temporarily living in the home of her friend. So this would be allowed under the IHSS program. So next, based on what we know, is it true that Martha cannot live safely at home without assistance? Yes, it's true. The facts tell us that. So for these reasons, Martha is likely eligible for IHSS. So great job, everybody. Thank you for responding in the chat. And then we can go to the next slide. Okay, so now let's go over the various services, right, that are offered under IHSS. What services can somebody be provided hours for in order to facilitate certain tasks, specific tasks? So here we're going to divide things into categories, and then we'll go a little bit more in depth into some of these categories. But some of these tasks or services that can be provided under the IHSS program include domestic services, related services, personal care services, accompaniment to medical appointments or alternate resources. Also paramedical services, time-limited services, which we'll discuss, and then protective supervision. So these are all services that can be provided to somebody that may be eligible for IHSS. And here at the very bottom of the slide or on the screen, you'll see that there's a link here. And this is a link to an IHSS notice of action, which is sometimes called by its acronym an NOA. And this has a list of all these services and the subcategories of these services, which we'll go over in the next few slides. Okay. So the first one is domestic services. So what is that? So domestic services are general household chores that help maintain the cleanliness of a home or the space that a person lives in. It includes, and I'll read the list here. So sweeping, vacuuming, washing and waxing of floor surfaces, washing kitchen counters and sinks, cleaning the bathroom, storing food and supplies, taking out the garbage, dusting and picking up, cleaning the oven and the stove, cleaning and defrosting a refrigerator. This one is less common, but technically a service that can be offered is bringing in fuel or heating for cooking purposes from a fuel bin in the yard, if that is your cooking situation. There are still some remote areas in California where this is still a viable means of cooking. So this is placed here for that reason. Also, changing bed linens is another service that can be provided under the category of domestic services. Okay, go to the next one. So pretty self-explanatory, right? Domestic services. Next one is related services. And there are sub-tasks or subcategories within this. But related services are sometimes grouped with domestic services, but it's important to remember that they're distinct and separate from domestic services. So related services include meal preparation or meal cleanup. Meal preparation, right, can include planning menus, preparing foods, cooking and serving the meals. Meal cleanup is defined as helping to clean up the cooking area right after preparing a meal. Includes washing, drying, and putting away cookware, dishes, utensils. Or it could even include loading or unloading a dishwasher if an individual has a dishwasher. One thing that I will note here is that meal cleanup does not include general cleaning of a refrigerator, a stove, oven, countertop, the sinks. And that's because those services are domestic services, right? So meal cleanup refers specifically to cleaning up after a meal. So that's just something to point out. Next, we have laundry, which is washing, drying, folding, and putting away clothes and household linens. Sometimes people have a misconception that they're just washing clothes and maybe drying, but it also includes folding and putting away those clothes and household linens. Also, we have grocery shopping, which can include making a grocery list, traveling to and from the store, shopping, loading, unloading, and storing food that is purchased. And then here we have other shopping or errands. That could be picking up prescriptions, buying clothes or toiletries, reading important documents such as medication instructions, food labels, even bills or utility bills or any legal document or bill. So those are considered other shopping or other errands. Okay, the next one. Next, we have the big category, which is personal care services. And these are also known as non-medical personal services. And we have a few, right? We have a long list here. We have feeding, which is helping somebody with eating their meals, including cleaning their face and their hands before and after meals. We also have bathing, oral hygiene, and grooming. So helping somebody bathe, right, or shower, which includes shampooing them. Also, bowel and bladder care is helping a person with using the toilet, using a bedpan or urinal if they use one, emptying and cleaning an ostomy bag if a person uses an ostomy bag, or diapers. Can include wiping and cleaning the person. And then grooming, right, could be if you need to help somebody shave, right? That's an example of grooming. Next, we have dressing here, which is helping the person take on and take off their clothes as necessary throughout the day. We also have transfer and ambulation, which sometimes get confused, but I'll explain what those are. So transfer includes usually moving somebody within the same room. So they could include transferring a person from a bed, a chair, or a couch, or a wheelchair, a walker, to another place within the room. Ambulation is different. It involves help with walking, right, within the home, or getting in and out of cars, right, if they're on a way to a medical appointment, for example. So that's ambulation. Also help with prostheses. We have here, which can include leg braces, visual hearing aids, artificial limbs. So taking off or putting on those devices, and also maintaining and cleaning them. Also help with medications, right? And a part of this is also repositioning too, but so helping with medications, right, is reminding the person to take their prescribed medication or even over-the-counter medication, setting up those medisets, those plastic containers where you would divide the medication that's taken daily. So yes, so there's a few that are not on here that I'll briefly mention. So one of them that is increasingly becoming one that we're seeing more often is, for example, some repositioning, which can include range of motion exercises. So sometimes physical therapists, although they're not doctors, they'll instruct families to reinforce range of motion exercises. So this includes that service can be provided. Also, menstrual care is another service that's provided, and also respiration assistance if a person needs help with breathing, such as self-administration of oxygen and cleaning breathing machines. So those are all personal care services that a person can obtain hours under the IHSS program. The next one is less common, but technically a person can receive these are time-limited services, meaning that they're not continuously provided throughout the year. So for the ones that I previously mentioned, those are going to be provided throughout the year without fail, unless there's a reassessment and there's a change. But as a general rule, right, those services are not time-limited. However, these here are. So that includes heavy cleaning, and that's just removing hazardous debris or dirt in the home. It's authorized one time only and only under certain circumstances. Where I have seen this is sometimes a provider comes into the picture and they're caring for a person who, due to their disability, right, was unable to maintain the home. So it requires heavy cleaning. So this can be provided. This is a time-limited service that can be provided to a provider, for example, to give them extra time to clean. Also, removing yard hazards is a time-limited service that can be provided, which can include, removing weeds or high grass, or also shoveling ice or snow if you live in a location where it snows. And lastly, we have teaching and demonstration. So hours can be obtained for teaching and showing services provided by IHSS providers to a recipient that can eventually perform the services themselves. Certain limitations would apply there. And not all services are eligible for this. It includes housework or domestic services, meal prep, meal cleanup, laundry, bathing, feeding, dressing, and yard work. So things that you could teach an individual to do on their own. So more time will be provided to a provider that can teach and demonstrate these services. But again, it would have to mean that the recipient is capable of learning these tasks. And so in most cases, right, for teaching and demonstration, you're limited to 3 months. You'll only be provided hours every month for 3 months, additional hours for this. Okay. So we can go to the next slide where we have our second question. A bit of a tricky one, but we'll see. So we'll see if people will answer it correctly. So this is our true or false question. I'll read the statement and then please let us know if this is true or false in the chat if you're comfortable. So true or false, a person that is being assessed for in-home supportive services or IHSS can receive hours that allow a provider to teach or demonstrate how to do routine laundry for a 13-month period. True or false? Is this answer true or false? And I will mention this is a tricky one. And going back to time limited services, you can get it for heavy cleaning, for removing yard hazards, for teaching and demonstrating. But if you teach and demonstrate, you won't be provided hours for more than 3 months. So, okay. I think give it a few more moments and then we'll go to the next slide. Okay. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so answer here is false. And I'll admit this is a tricky one. So remember that teaching and demonstration is generally limited to a 3-month period. Here, we're being told that the provider is seeking teaching and demonstration for 13 months, which will not be allowed, right, under the IHSS program. So for that reason, this is false. But thank you everybody for answering. And yeah, this is a tricky one. So, okay. So now let's talk about protective supervision, which is, you know, a huge, nuanced, complex topic. And it has its own eligibility criteria within the IHSS program, but we'll discuss as much as we can today. Of course, we can't dive too deep into the topic, but we will do as much as we can today. So protective supervision is a service under the IHSS program for people who have a mental disability or condition or a mental impairment and who are non-self-directing. And there's a lot of questions about what this means, right? What is non-self-directing? So non-self-directing generally means that a person cannot assess or appreciate the dangers or risks of harm that are caused by certain behaviors that result from their disability, their mental disability. And so this is evaluated by considering 3 things: a person's memory, their orientation, and their judgment. So memory is being able to remember learned behaviors and information from a distant and recent past. Orientation is a person's awareness of time, of place, of themselves and other people in their environment. And judgment is the ability to make decisions as to not put oneself in danger. So these 3 areas are evaluated, right, when determining if a person is non-self-directing. And what doctors or what IHSS social workers will do or the county will do is they'll assign a rank to each one of these, either a 1, a 2, or a 5. 1 means that there's no issue in the area. 2 means that there's a mild impairment or issue in the area, and 5 meaning that there's a severe issue or deficit in these areas. So each one will be ranked differently. But that's essentially, if I've seen that if a person's judgment is severely impaired, you know, that's a stronger likelihood that the person is non-self-directing. Okay. The next requirement is that the person requires 24-hour supervision to protect that person against self-injury, hazard, or accident. So this does not mean that a person requires supervision every second of every minute of every hour of every day, right? It does not mean that. It means that the person requires supervision because the risks of harm are frequent and unpredictable. And that itself requires constant supervision because you can't predict when the behaviors are going to happen or how frequent they will be, right? But they're frequent enough where you need to observe them constantly. And an example of this let's talk about unpredictable or predictable behavior as it relates to this 24-hour supervision. So let's say a person is turning on the hot stove and leaving it on. Okay, that's a concerning behavior, right? The person can burn themselves. But now let's break it down. When would it be predictable, meaning that it may not be eligible for protective supervision? And when would it be unpredictable, when it would warrant protective supervision? So let's start with predictable. So let's say that the person who turns on the stove and leaves it on, that behavior only happens when a caregiver is cooking. And though given an opportunity, the person doesn't engage in that activity at any other time. So they only do it when a caregiver is cooking. So then that means that the behavior is predictable, right? We know that it's going to happen when the provider is cooking for the individual. So that may not be eligible for protective supervision. But if the person does it at various times of the day, if given the opportunity, whether the caregiver is cooking or not, or they even forget that the stove is on, right? That behavior is unpredictable. And it's still a risk of harm. So in that situation, the person may be eligible for protective supervision. So remember, the behavior has to be frequent enough and unpredictable for it to require protective supervision. So those are the three requirements generally for protective supervision. However, there's an extra requirement when a child is involved. So for children under 18 years of age that may need protective supervision, the minor must need more supervision than a child of the same age without a impairment or disability. So a question to ask here, right? How do you compare a child with a disability that may need protective supervision with another child without a disability? So a question to ask yourself is, does it take more time and more intensity to care for the child in comparison with a child of the same age without a mental disability? That's the main question there. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So here we have a list of the types of behaviors that would potentially require protective supervision. It includes individuals wandering from the home, getting lost, eating non-food or non-edible items, wandering into the street without checking for cars, attempting tasks beyond a person's physical or mental capabilities, and not understanding that they could hurt themselves. Think of people trying to move furniture or heavy objects without any assessment that it could hurt them, climbing onto high spaces, or climbing tall furniture, jumping off, things of that nature. Also turning on the stove and forgetting to turn it off. In some certain situations, also self-injurious behaviors like biting oneself or scratching oneself or hitting oneself. Also lack of stranger danger awareness. So these are some of the behaviors that could warrant protective supervision. And here at the very bottom of the screen, the slide, you'll see a link to a form called the SOC 821, which is technically not required, but it's very helpful. It's a form that a medical professional or doctor will fill out where they could explain why they feel that a child or an adult would need protective supervision. And they're going to assess memory, orientation, and judgment. They have to confirm that the person can physically put themselves in danger, and they'll have an opportunity to provide comments, right? For example, if they're aware of injuries that have happened or have almost happened in the past, a doctor or medical professional can include that in this form. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. And this is an important one. Because oftentimes when people request protective supervision and they're denied, social workers will list one of these reasons or all of these reasons as to why they decided to deny the service. So it's good to understand what each one would entail. So when is protective supervision not available? So one is friendly visiting or social activities. And again, think of infrequent events, right, that happen. Could be, for example, somebody who gets a visit from a friend infrequently, right? And maybe there's um, not necessarily due a disability, but there could be like tension, right? And then that it could be physical altercations, right? Things like that, right? Friendly visiting or social activities. Um, or if there's frequent visitors to the home who may be strangers, right? This whole thing about stranger danger awareness, would this be available for that type of service? Not necessarily, right? Um, so that's one area where protective supervision may not be available. Another one would be when the need is caused by medical condition and the form of supervision required is medical. And an example of this could be a person with diabetes who needs supervision in case they become hypoglycemic, right? And need an insulin shot, right? This wouldn't be considered for protective supervision because it's a medical condition. It's not born of a mental condition. Another one is in anticipation of a medical emergency, kind of following the same lines. So let's say a person has congestive heart failure, and the need for supervision is in anticipation of a heart attack, meaning, oh, we have to keep an eye on this individual because there's a possibility they might have a heart attack. So this service would not be available for that because it's a medical emergency, which is tied to a medical condition as well. Also, to prevent or control antisocial or aggressive behavior. This is a big one, right? Examples of this is getting into fights or destroying property, or sometimes uh, hurting oneself, right? If it can be considered antisocial or aggressive, meaning like you punch a wall or something of that nature. Um, so this is a big one because sometimes, depending on the disability, the mental disability of the individual, it could be framed as it's not an antisocial or aggressive behavior, but rather it's uh, a, a behavior that emanates from a mental disability. Let's say, for example, autism or something of that nature, right? Where um, although it may appear to be antisocial or aggressive, um, people with autism, right? Uh, there's the condition is very nuanced, complex, right? So it could be that an individual may be overwhelmed and that's how they react, right? They punch a wall when they're overwhelmed. That's not necessarily aggressive or antisocial behavior. It's a behavior that emanates from a disability. The same thing goes for the next one, which is another one that's often cited by social workers, is to guard against deliberate self-destructive behavior. So this contemplates behavior such as when an individual knowingly intends to harm themselves. So this specific situation and the needs of the individual have to be evaluated by a medical professional, and evaluations are important, or a doctor's letter, because again, um, just because there's a behavior doesn't automatically mean that there's intention or it's done deliberately. Going back to the example of somebody hitting themselves, right? One example that I've seen used in the past by social workers is they stated that a child was throwing a tantrum, meaning that they only were acting out, so to speak, when they weren't being provided something like a toy. So the social worker tried to frame it as it's deliberate behavior, meaning that it's self-directing. They have a behavior, but the behavior is because the child wants something in return. So it had to be framed differently because it was because of the child's disability, autism. They often felt overwhelmed in certain situations, so they reacted in that way, not because they wanted something, but rather because they were reacting to a situation, and it was a response. So just things to be mindful of when somebody's seeking protective supervision. Um, be very clear with the language, right? In terms of it being deliberate or intentional, because social workers will often gravitate to that in order to deny the service when it's actually needed. And here at the very bottom of the screen or slide, you'll see a link, which is the manual policies and procedures, which are basically the laws that govern the IHSS program in California, or regulations. And it has the specific policies as to protective supervision, right? What the county has to comply with and abide by. Okay, go to the next slide. And going again, just to reiterate, right? Protective supervision it can be a complex and nuanced area, and everybody's situation is going to be unique, right? But again, if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to our intake line, so you can be connected to an advocate or attorney that can help you further with that. Okay, so next, let's talk about paramedical services. So these are services that are prescribed by a doctor for a person's health, and that require some training and judgment to perform. And I'll read what the law, right, the Welfare Institutions Code says verbatim. So in-home supportive services include those necessary paramedical services that are ordered by a licensed healthcare professional who is lawfully authorized to do so, which persons could provide for themselves, but for their functional limitations. And then next slide, we'll go over what that means. But here at the bottom of the screen, you'll find a link to a publication that our organization has that provides more information about paramedical services if you want to learn more. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So let's kind of summarize what the law was saying, right? So a person is time or hours for paramedical services can be provided if the following can be established or demonstrated. One, the person can't perform the service at all, right, by themselves. Two, the activity is necessary to maintain that person's health. And three, the service requires training and judgment to perform. And some of these things can include like puncturing skin, inserting a medical device into a body orifice, injections, right? Things of that nature that require training and judgment to perform. And so if we go to the next slide, we have a few examples of this. So once a doctor has determined that these are services that are necessary, they'll order and there's a form. If you see at the bottom of the screen, there's a form called the SOC 321 that a doctor would fill out in order to order these services. But some examples of this include administering medications, and which could involve, right, crushing medication or pills or tablets, measuring. That would require some training and judgment to do. Also giving injections, right, because you're puncturing the skin, putting a needle into the skin. It could also include range of motion exercises, which would mean improving the movement of a specific joint. And again, this would be directed by a doctor, right? The next one is pressure sore or wound care, catheter insertions, a bowel program, right? If you have to digitally stimulate a person's rectum to facilitate bowel movements, this would qualify. Also, if you have to administer enemas or suppositories, tube feeding, also trachea care and suctioning. So these are all examples of paramedical services that a doctor can order, and so that a person can be provided time in this area. And what I've seen from my experience, right, is that if a doctor fills this out, right, there's generally no pushback, because these are very straightforward. And something else that I've seen approved, right, is maybe not crushing medication, but if it's liquid medication, measuring it, right, and using kind of a needle to administer it into the throat of an individual. I've seen that count as a paramedical service because it's something that's going into a body orifice. But that's another example. Okay, can go to the next slide. So now let's talk about children, right? So children, of course, can be eligible for IHSS. And there are certain categories which a child can be eligible for. not including domestic services. Domestic services generally will not be provided, right, for children, but personal care services, that long list that I mentioned, right, related services like meal prep, meal cleanup, um, paramedical services as well. They're prescribed by a doctor, protective supervision, and assistance with travel to approved places like medical appointments. What I will say though is that depending on the age of the child, sometimes extraordinary need would have to be established, meaning that the need is so beyond what would normally be expected of a child of the same age without that same disability, right? If there's an extraordinary need, um, time can be provided. Because what happens is social workers will use a chart, right? The hourly task guidelines and the age developmental guidelines to determine if a child can get a service or time for a service. Um, and sometimes the guide tells them that because of the age of the child, they wouldn't be eligible for a service. But that doesn't automatically mean that they're ineligible. It just means that a person has to show that there's an extraordinary need, right? That the need is so beyond what would normally be expected of a child in that situation compared to another child without a disability, that time should be provided in that area. So an example of that could be laundry. That's a common example where a child is incontinent because of their disability, and that requires that a 5 or 6 year old um, uh, that laundry be done more often because of that, because they may soil their clothing. So there's an extraordinary need there, right? Because a 5, 6 year old normally would be able to independently go to the restroom. And although the child is not expected to do laundry, there's an extraordinary need because the parent has to frequently wash clothes more often for the child because they soil themselves. So that's an example. Okay, we can go to the next slide, which is a longer hypothetical, but again, we're going to go through them together. So I'll read the hypothetical and then the question, and then it's, feel free to write your answers in the chat. So, okay, I'll begin. So David is 52 years old. He receives full scope Medi-Cal because he has limited income, and he regularly sees a doctor because he has type 1 diabetes. Recently, David was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. He lives alone with no help, and because of his mental disability, David has accumulated a lot of debris and waste in his home. He forgets to eat and can't properly bathe himself. He tries to cook, but has left the stove on and unattended. While outside, he often wanders around with no direction. He often forgets to take his medication. He has family members out of state that he is close to. And despite David's wishes, his family members want to place him in an assisted living facility. But David doesn't want that for himself. So what options are available to David? Let's first start off with the first. There's two questions, right? And we'll start with the first one. But is he eligible for IHSS? That's the first question. The second question is, what services can he receive? Okay, we can go to the next slide, where the question is he eligible for IHSS? That's the first question. So remember, is he a resident, right? Is he in any of those demographics, blind, disabled, or 65 years of age or older? Does he receive SSI or Medi-Cal, or is he Medi-Cal eligible? Does he live in his own home? Can he safely live at home without assistance? So knowing David's information, what do we think? Do we think he's eligible for IHSS likely? Great, we'll give it a few more moments that everybody's answering correctly in the chat. Oh, amazing, amazing. Great. Fantastic. Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, so let's go next. Honey, if we can click the next. Great, yes. So you're all correct in the chat. Yes. David in this situation would likely be eligible for IHSS. We'll go to the next one. Okay. So now the next question is, what services can David receive? Right? Looking at his situation, what services could he receive? Now that we know he's eligible, what could a social worker approve him for? What areas? And as a reminder, these are the areas that we have: domestic services, related services, non-medical personal services, accompaniment to medical appointments, protective supervision, paramedical services, time-limited services. So, okay, let's go through this. So domestic services, yes, I think it's clear, right? There's a lot of buildup and debris in his home, so it's clear that he would need domestic services. Also, in addition to that, right, he might need heavy cleaning services, which are time limited, but a provider could be given more hours to help clean up the home. It's also clear because of his dementia, because he forgets to do things, meal preparation, meal cleanup, laundry, food shopping, those would be appropriate for David. Also for non-medical personal care services, things such as feeding, right, would be appropriate. Dressing, bathing or hygiene and grooming. It's also clear that he would not be able to go to medical appointments by himself, right? So he would need accompaniment. He could get that service. And lastly, protective supervision, right? We're given some facts, right? That when he's out in the community, right, he tends to wander, right? So there's a possibility that if he was left at home by himself, he could easily open the door and wander out onto the street. So there's a possibility he could be eligible for that as well. So, okay, so we can go to the next one. Okay, so now let's talk about how hours are calculated. So the IHSS has 4 different programs within it, one called the Community First Choice Option program, and most recipients will be placed in this program. We also have the Personal Care Services program, the IHSS Plus Option program, the IHSS Residual program. That's sometimes where a share of cost is paid for Medi-Cal. So depending on the program that you are in, there's a maximum amount of hours that can be provided in any month. It could range from 195 hours to 283 hours, right? The max in any given situation. And we won't go through them in detail, but you can certainly look at that link that we provided in regards to protect supervision, and it'll provide you more explanation as to the max and in what circumstances it can be provided. Okay, another thing that we want to mention is proration as to related services and domestic services. This means that depending on how many, let's say you have a provider who lives in the home with the recipient and some tasks are shared. So that means that time can be reduced if tasks are shared amongst people living in the home. Let's use an example. So you have a live-in provider and there's a need for domestic services. But the services would be divided, right? Depending on the amount, the rooms that are shared, right? Where the provider has to clean. But for example, the living room can be shared, the bathroom can be shared, the kitchen can be shared. So time would be reduced for that. And what I've seen is social workers will allot, and every county does it differently, but I've seen LA County allot 1 hour per room. But of course, they reduce it if cleaning or domestic services for that room are shared. Another one is alternative resources. So this can include adult or child daycare centers, community resource centers, senior centers, respite centers. So if identified, these service hours could be reduced from IHSS hours, meaning while they're in a different location and different facility, their staff provide services, which means a provider doesn't have to provide their services. So time can be reduced in that situation. Okay, can go to the next slide. There's a lot of text here, but I'll briefly go through this. So so here we have a link to the tools that social workers use when they're assessing people for IHSS and those services. And as a general rule, social workers will assign a rank to the different services, anywhere from 1 through 5. 1 being independent, the person can do the task themselves without any issues, to a rank of 5, which means that the individual is totally dependent. So the higher the rank, the more time will be provided to the individual. And here we have a link to the hourly task guidelines, which will show you, right, depending on the rank, a social worker the suggestion would be to provide a certain amount of time, depending on the rank in a given area. But I will point out that these are guidelines, and exceptions can be made if more time is needed, because it's not mandatory that social workers stick to the time that is suggested, right? If more time is needed, social workers should look to provide more time. Okay, can go to the next slide. So next, how do you apply for IHSS? You would contact your local IHSS county welfare office and apply. Here we have a link to the age-appropriate guideline, the county IHSS offices, I apologize. So you can look for the one in your area. There's an application that has to be completed as well. You can follow the link here. And then a healthcare certification form, which is a form that a doctor or medical professional has to sign off on in order to confirm that the individual meets the requirement due to being a person with a disability, for example, or a child with a disability. Okay. We can go to the next slide. And so as part of the process, once you're applying, right, let's say you apply for the first time, a social worker or the county will schedule an in-home assessment with an individual. It's important to be prepared for this assessment because social workers, this is the operative information that a social worker will use to determine the rank of an individual and how much time will be provided, or if they're eligible for a category. So they'll ask various questions, right? They'll ask the recipient questions if they can, to test. Let's say it's a person's requesting protective supervision, right? Asking questions to assess their memory, their orientation, their judgment. So it's best to be prepared for these assessments. So you can definitely provide your own documentation if you have it, a doctor's letters. DRC has a fair hearing guide and self-assessment template that you can use in order to provide notes of why you feel a recipient needs hours in a certain category. And then, of course, after that, generally a social worker has 30 days within the time of once the application is submitted to do the assessment and to issue a notice of action, where you will be notified if an individual is approved or not for IHSS, and if they are approved, what categories they would be approved in. Okay, next slide. So let's say you are an advocate, a loved one of a person that's receiving or who applied for IHSS, and you felt that the determination under the notice of action was incorrect. It could be that you disagree. Let's say the social worker only provided 20 minutes for laundry, right? And they should have provided the full amount, right? You can appeal these types of decisions, and a person generally has 90 days to appeal the decision in the notice of action, and you could do so online. You can submit an appeal in writing. Notices of action will have a sheet where you can fill in and turn in if that's how you want to appeal. But something we will mention is aid paid pending. So the county has to notify at least 10 days prior to an effective date of action. So when you request aid paid pending, meaning you want to appeal, but before the reduction in hours, or this is usually the case when somebody's already receiving IHSS and social workers want to reduce hours. If you want the hours to stay where they initially were, you should appeal and request aid paid pending before the notice of action is to take effect. Let's say that it's going to take effect on July 1st. you receive a notice of action today, you would want to appeal as soon as you can or before July 1st in order for your hours to remain the same, to not be reduced. And then here we have the link to where you can appeal online. And then you also have hearing guides or guides that our organization has developed to help you with the process of the appeal and preparing for appeals when it comes to terminations or reductions in IHSS hours. Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, final question. And again, hypothetical, and then we're going to have a question. Okay, so let me read the hypothetical. So Daniel was approved for 283 hours of services a month, the maximum, under the Community First Choice Option program for IHSS. The following year, Daniel had a reassessment, and the IHSS social worker issued a notice of action, reducing the hours from 283 to 142 hours. The notice of action is dated June 13th, 2025. However, Daniel's condition has not changed. Everything is the same, right? So there's a disagreement. It's believed that this decision is incorrect. So the notice of action is dated June 13, 2025, but because his condition has not changed, right, there's a disagreement. And he received the notice in the mail on June 16th of 2025. And the notice of action states that the reduction will take effect on July 1st, 2025. So the question is, what should Daniel do if he wants to keep his IHSS hours during the appeal? He wants to keep the 283 hours during the appeal. So what should he do? A, ask the social worker for a reassessment. B, appeal the decision within 90 days. C, appeal the decision before the reduction takes effect and request aid paid pending. Or D, B, or C. This is a tricky one. And I'll give people a few moments. Remember, he wants to keep his IHSS hours during the appeal at 283. So what should he do? If he appeals after July 1st, 2025, would he keep those hours or would they go into effect? That's the question here. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So that was a tricky one. So the correct answer is C. So remember, if you want the hours to remain the same, you should appeal before the notice of action takes effect. Here, we know the notice of action will take effect on July 1st. So that means we should appeal as soon as possible, but no later than the end of June, right? In order to keep the same hours during the appeal, right? So there'll be an appeal and then there could be a hearing and the hours will remain the same until judge decides whether the county made a mistake or did not make a mistake. Great, thank you. Okay, we could go to the next slide. Great. And here on the slide, you see a list of resources that you can definitely refer to if you want to learn more. We have a webpage within our DRC website that has a list of all the various publications that relate to IHSS. We have a link to our intake information. You can call us, right, if you want more information or help with an IHSS issue. We also have a link to the regulations or the law that relate to IHSS. And then a link to the California Department of Social Services website for IHSS. Go to the next slide. Okay. And the next one is a link to the IHSS Training Academy. So these are all the materials that the county and state use to train social workers in IHSS matters. So if you follow this link, you'll have a copy of everything they teach the social workers and how to assess individuals. And that's helpful because then you'll know, right, prior to a social worker coming to do an in-home assessment, you'll have the information, right? And it's a lot of information, but if you have time, it's worthwhile to go through. Okay. And then this is a link to as of well, almost 2 years. California eliminated the parent-provider rules for minor IHSS recipients, meaning that the able and available parent individual rule no longer applies at the moment. So you can also look at that to learn more. Okay, I think now we can go to the next slide. Okay, I think this is a good moment to pause the recording, and then we can definitely take questions.
Yes.